I turned my husband's failing fashion brand into a 1.2 million empire. He divorced me and stole everything. But 1 year later, he was begging me for a job. My name is Lisa Chen, and I'm about to tell you a story that sounds like it came straight out of a Lifetime movie. Except this one actually happened, and somehow reality managed to be even more dramatic than fiction. 3 years ago, my husband Matthew hit me for the last time. Not because he suddenly developed a conscience, mind you, but because I finally learned that the best revenge isn't getting mad. It's getting your business back. Let me start from the beginning. Back when I was young, naive, and apparently had a sign on my forehead that read, "Please take advantage of me." Though I'm pretty sure it was invisible to everyone except manipulative men with failing businesses. I met Matthew Rivera at a fashion industry mixer in downtown Chicago. Picture this, a room full of wannabe designers sipping overpriced wine and pretending their polyester creations were the next big thing. I was there representing my marketing firm, which specialized in helping small fashion brands actually sell something, a novel concept apparently. Matthew owned what he generously called Rivera Fashion Wholesale, though Rivera's Closet of Broken Dreams would have been more accurate. He was distributing the kind of basic clothing that made Walmart's fashion line look haute couture. The man was hemorrhaging money faster than a designer handbag with a hole in it, losing about $30,000 a year in what can only be described as a masterclass in how not to run a business. But Matthew had something I found irresistible at the time: charm. The kind of smooth-talking confidence that makes you forget to ask important questions like, "Why exactly is your business failing?" Or, "Do you have anger management issues?" You know, the little details that might have saved me years of therapy. Our first date was at some trendy restaurant where the portions were smaller than my patience for small talk. But Matthew painted such beautiful pictures of our future together. He talked about building a fashion empire, about how my marketing expertise and his vision, and I use that term very loosely, could create something amazing. "Lisa," he said, leaning across the table with those dark eyes that I later learned were much better at hiding things than revealing them, "I can see us building something incredible together. You understand fashion, you have the connections, and I have the business foundation. We could be unstoppable." What he failed to mention was that his business foundation was more like quicksand, and I was about to become his life preserver. But hey, love makes you stupid, and I was apparently working toward a PhD in stupidity. The romance moved fast, which should have been red flag number 1, but I mistook speed for passion. Matthew was attentive, constantly texting, always wanting to spend time together. He'd show up at my apartment with flowers and stories about how I was different from other women, how I understood his dreams. "You're not like those other marketing girls," he'd say, which I took as a compliment rather than the warning it actually was. "You see the bigger picture. You understand what it takes to build something real." Within 6 months, he'd practically moved into my downtown loft. Within 8 months, he was suggesting we combine our finances for efficiency. And by month 10, when he proposed with a ring that probably cost less than my monthly coffee budget, I said yes because I'd somehow convinced myself that this was what love looked like. The wedding was small. My choice, since most of my friends had developed sudden scheduling conflicts when it came to watching me marry a man they'd dubbed Captain Red Flag behind my back. My sister Janet was my maid of honor, and I'll never forget the look on her face when Matthew and I exchanged vows. She later told me she was trying to figure out how to stage an intervention during the reception. "You looked happy," she said years later, but it was the kind of happy that comes from trying really, really hard to convince yourself of something. The first year of marriage was what I now recognize as the extended honeymoon phase of abuse. The part where they make you feel special while slowly isolating you from everyone who might point out that your husband is, technically speaking, a complete disaster. Matthew started small. First, it was gentle suggestions that my friends were negative influences who didn't understand our vision. Then it was concerns about my work stress and how maybe I should consider freelancing so we could spend more time together. Before I knew it, I was working from home, seeing my friends less, and spending more time listening to Matthew's elaborate plans for our future fashion empire. The business conversation started innocuously enough. Matthew would show me his financial reports, and reports is a generous term for what appeared to be numbers scribbled on napkins, and ask for my professional opinion. "Lisa, baby, I know you see the potential here," he'd say, spreading out invoices and receipts across our kitchen table like he was planning a military operation rather than trying to figure out why nobody wanted to buy his off-brand cargo pants. "I just need some capital to really scale this thing up." I should mention that at this point I had about $80,000 in savings. Not bad for a 34-year-old marketing professional, though not exactly buy a small country money either. I'd worked hard for that nest egg, saving for years while building my career and my network in the fashion industry. Matthew knew exactly how much I had saved. He'd made it his business to know, going through my financial statements with the thoroughness of an IRS auditor and the subtlety of a tornado. He'd frame it as being financially transparent in our marriage, which sounds romantic until you realize transparency apparently only went one way. "You know what's holding us back?" Matthew said one evening, after another day of what he called strategic planning, and what looked suspiciously like playing video games while his business burned down around him. "We need to think bigger. Your marketing expertise, my business infrastructure. We could transform Rivera Fashion Wholesale into something incredible." He painted such a compelling picture. We'd rebrand the company, use my industry connections to source better products, leverage social media and influencer marketing to reach new customers. It would be our business, our future, our empire. The first red flag that I somehow missed came when I suggested we make it official. Put my name on the business registration, make me an actual partner rather than just the woman bankrolling the operation. "Baby, that's going to complicate things legally," Matthew said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone that I was beginning to recognize. "The business is already established in my name. Adding partners now would mean restructuring everything, new paperwork, tax complications. It's better to keep things simple for now." Simple. Right. Simple like how it's simple to hand over your life savings to someone who treats business planning like a casual hobby. But I was in love, or what I thought was love at the time. Looking back, I realize I was in love with the potential, with the dream Matthew sold me, not with the reality of who he actually was. Love, as it turns out, is not actually blind. It just gets really good at making excuses for what it chooses not to see. So I wrote the check. $80,000, handed over with a kiss and a promise that we were building something beautiful together. "This is it, Lisa," Matthew said, holding the check like it was a winning lottery ticket. "This is the beginning of everything." He was right about that, though not in the way either of us expected. The transformation of Rivera Fashion Wholesale into what became Rivera Boutique Collections was... Well, let's just say it wasn't Matthew's vision that made it work. While he was busy playing CEO and posting inspirational quotes about entrepreneurship on LinkedIn, I was actually running the business. I started by completely overhauling our supplier relationships. Matthew had been working with manufacturers who specialized in what I can only describe as clothes-shaped objects, garments that technically covered the human body, but did so with all the style and quality of a garbage bag with armholes. Using my industry connections, I found suppliers who could provide actual fashion, trendy pieces that didn't look like they'd been designed by someone who'd only heard clothing described secondhand. We started carrying brands that people actually wanted to wear, not just clothes that happened to be available. Next came the social media strategy. Matthew's idea of marketing had been posting blurry photos of hangers on a Facebook page with 12 followers, half of whom were his relatives feeling obligated to like his posts out of family loyalty. I brought in influencers, real ones, not just people with a lot of selfies and questionable life choices. We partnered with fashion bloggers, Instagram personalities, and even a few micro-celebrities who actually wore our clothes and looked good doing it. Suddenly, Rivera Boutique Collections had a presence, a brand identity, and something that had been foreign to Matthew's business model: customers who paid money for products. The private label line was my proudest achievement. Working with local designers, we created exclusive pieces that you couldn't find anywhere else. These weren't knockoffs or mass-produced basics. They were unique, stylish, and reasonably priced. We called it the RBC Signature Collection, and it became our biggest seller. The online platform was another game changer. Matthew had been operating like it was 1985, relying entirely on walk-in traffic and the occasional phone order from shops that had apparently never heard of this newfangled thing called the internet. I built a direct-to-consumer website that actually functioned, looked professional, and made it easy for people to buy our products without having to visit Matthew's warehouse, which had all the ambiance of an abandoned airplane hangar. The results spoke for themselves. In 18 months, we went from losing $30,000 a year to generating over $1.2 million in revenue. Not bad for a business that had previously been about as successful as a chocolate teapot. Now, you might be wondering how someone can build $1 million business and still end up getting slapped around by the guy taking all the credit. Well, buckle up, because we're just getting to the good part. If you want to see how this revenge story unfolds, make sure you're subscribed. Spoiler alert, Matthew's about to learn some very expensive lessons about underestimating people. You'd think Matthew would have been grateful. You'd think he might have acknowledged that his wife had just saved his business and quite possibly his entire financial future. You'd think a lot of things, but you'd be wrong, because Matthew had a very special talent for taking credit for other people's work while simultaneously making them feel like they should be grateful for the opportunity. The first time Matthew hit me, it was over a $10,000 expense that I couldn't account for. I'd been reviewing our business expenses, like a responsible business partner does, when I noticed a rather large withdrawal that seemed to have vanished into thin air. "Matthew," I said, pointing to the transaction on my laptop screen, "what's this $10,000 for? It's not in any of our supplier invoices." He was standing behind me, and I felt his whole body tense. When I turned around to look at him, his face had changed completely. Gone was the charming entrepreneur, replaced by something cold and calculating that I'd never seen before. "Are you questioning me?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Are you actually questioning how I run my own business?" "Our business," I corrected, which was apparently the wrong thing to say. The slap came so fast I didn't see it coming. One moment I was sitting at our kitchen table with my laptop, and the next I was on the floor with my cheek burning and my ears ringing. Matthew stood over me, and for the first time I saw him for what he really was. "Don't you ever question me again," he said, as casually as if he'd just commented on the weather. "I built this business. I make the decisions. You're here to help, not to audit my every move." I sat there on the kitchen floor, my hand pressed to my cheek, trying to process what had just happened. This was my husband. This was the man who'd promised to love and protect me. This was the man I'd given my life savings to, the man I'd trusted with my future. "I'm sorry," I whispered, and I still can't believe those were the first words out of my mouth. Not "how dare you," not "get out of my house," but "I'm sorry." Because that's what abuse does. It makes you apologize for your own mistreatment. Matthew's face immediately softened, and he knelt down beside me with tears in his eyes. "Oh God, Lisa, I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me. The stress of the business, the pressure, I would never hurt you. You know I would never hurt you." And just like that, he was back to being the man I'd fallen in love with. Gentle, apologetic, devastated by his own actions. He held me while I cried, promising it would never happen again, swearing that he'd never been so ashamed of anything in his life. "You're everything to me," he whispered into my hair. "I can't lose you. Please don't leave me. I'll get help. I'll do whatever it takes." That $10,000, by the way, had gone to a gambling debt. Not that I found out until much later, of course. Matthew had developed quite the taste for high-stakes poker games, and apparently he wasn't very good at them. But that night, as he held me and promised to change, I believed him. Because the alternative, accepting that I'd married an abuser who was stealing from our business, was too horrible to contemplate. The second time he hit me was 6 weeks later. I'd suggested that we should probably get some insurance for the business, the kind of basic financial planning that normal companies do. Matthew saw this as another challenge to his authority, another sign that I didn't trust his judgment. This time, instead of a slap, I got shoved backward into the wall hard enough to leave bruises on my shoulder blades. The message was clear. Questioning Matthew's decisions was not acceptable, even when those decisions made about as much sense as using newspaper for wallpaper. "You need to remember your place," he said after pushing me. "I'm the CEO, you're the marketing consultant. Don't confuse the two." The third time was the worst. I'd had the audacity to ask why our business checking account was overdrawn when we'd just had our biggest sales month ever. Apparently, Matthew had been using company funds to pay for his mother's medical bills, his brother's car loan, and what appeared to be a small shopping spree at Best Buy. He didn't just hit me that time. He grabbed me by the throat and slammed me against the refrigerator hard enough to leave a dent in both the appliance and my sense of security. "You want to know where the money went?" he snarled, his face inches from mine. "It went to family, real family. Not some uptight consultant who thinks she owns the place because she wrote a check." After each incident, the pattern was the same. Matthew would be horrified by his own behavior, would cry and apologize and promise to get anger management counseling. He'd be extra sweet for weeks afterward, bringing me flowers, cooking dinner, telling me how much he loved me and how he couldn't live without me. "You make me want to be a better man," he'd say, and I'd almost believe him. Almost. But the business kept growing, and Matthew's need to maintain control grew with it. He started removing my name from important communications, taking meetings without me, and presenting himself as the sole genius behind our success. At industry events, which had once been our territory together, Matthew would introduce himself as the founder and CEO of Rivera Boutique Collections. When people asked about me, standing right there beside him, he'd smile and say, "This is my wife, Lisa. She helps out with the social media stuff." Helps out with the social media stuff, as if I hadn't single-handedly built the entire marketing strategy that had transformed his failing wholesale operation into $1 million business. The gaslighting was perhaps worse than the physical abuse. Matthew had a gift for making me question my own memory, my own contributions, my own worth. "Lisa, you're being paranoid," he'd say when I pointed out that he was taking credit for my work. "Of course I mention your contributions. Maybe you just weren't paying attention." Or, "You're being too sensitive. Everyone knows you're important to the business. I don't need to spell it out every time." Or my personal favorite, "You're acting crazy. This is exactly the kind of behavior that makes people not want to work with you." The isolation was gradual, but complete. Matthew convinced me that my friends didn't understand our business relationship, that they were jealous of our success. He suggested I work from home more often, for efficiency, which meant I had fewer opportunities to maintain my professional relationships. "Why do you need to go to those networking events?" he'd ask. "We have everything we need right here. Besides, some of those people are competitors. We don't want to give away our trade secrets." Our trade secrets. As if the secret to our success wasn't sitting right there in our living room, systematically being erased from the company narrative. The most insidious part was how Matthew managed to make me feel grateful for the abuse. He'd frame his violence as passion, his control as protection, his theft as family responsibility. "I only get angry because I care so much," he'd say after hitting me. "If I didn't love you, if this business didn't mean everything to me, I wouldn't get so emotional." And somehow, in the twisted logic of an abusive relationship, this made sense to me. His violence was proof of his commitment. His control was evidence of his investment in our future. His lies were just creative storytelling. By the end of our second year in business, Rivera Boutique Collections was generating serious money. We'd been featured in several fashion blogs, had partnerships with major influencers, and were in talks with a department store chain about carrying our private label line. Matthew was riding high on what he'd convinced himself was his own success. He'd started wearing expensive suits, driving a luxury car, and dropping casual mentions of my company and my vision in every conversation. I, meanwhile, was working 16-hour days, managing supplier relationships, overseeing production, handling customer service, and maintaining our social media presence, all while walking on eggshells around a man who thought hitting his wife was an acceptable response to business disagreements. The breaking point came when I suggested we should probably make our partnership official. Actually put my name on the business registration, given that I was doing about 80% of the work and had provided 100% of the initial capital. "Are you insane?" Matthew said, and I could see that familiar anger building in his eyes. "The business is established. You can't just change ownership structures because you're feeling insecure about your role." "I'm not feeling insecure," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and professional. "I'm asking for legal recognition of my actual contributions to this company." That's when Matthew showed me exactly what he thought of my contributions. He hit me so hard I saw stars, then grabbed me by the hair and dragged me to the computer. "You want to see contributions?" he snarled, forcing me to look at the screen. "Here are the tax documents. Here's the business registration. Here's the bank account. See any other names on there? Because I don't." He was right, of course. Every official document bore only his name. I'd been so trusting, so naive, so eager to build something together that I'd handed over my entire investment without securing any legal protection. "You're nothing," Matthew said, his grip tightening on my hair. "You're a marketing consultant I happen to be married to. That's it. Don't confuse helping out with owning something." That night, as I lay in bed with an ice pack on my swollen face, I finally understood what my sister had been trying to tell me for years. I wasn't in a marriage. I wasn't in a business partnership. I was in a hostage situation, and my captor had just made it very clear that he had no intention of ever letting me go. But Matthew had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated exactly how smart, how connected, and how absolutely furious his marketing consultant could be. The thing about living with an abuser is that you develop survival skills you never knew you needed, like learning to take photos of bruises without looking suspicious, or memorizing which lies your husband tells to which people so you can keep your stories straight. You become a detective in your own life, gathering evidence of crimes you're not even sure you're allowed to call crimes. I started what I mentally called the documentation project about 3 months before everything fell apart. It began innocently enough. I was just trying to keep better track of our business expenses, since Matthew's accounting methods seemed to involve throwing receipts in a drawer and hoping the IRS would develop amnesia. But as I dug deeper into our finances, I started noticing patterns that made my blood run cold. Money disappearing from our business accounts in round numbers. Always amounts that wouldn't show up on casual reviews, but significant enough to add up. Payments to contractors who never seemed to deliver any actual work. Mysterious business expenses that coincidentally matched the cost of Matthew's new golf clubs or his mother's mortgage payment. I started printing everything: bank statements, supplier invoices, email communications, social media posts where Matthew took credit for campaigns I'd designed. I kept it all in a folder hidden in my car because apparently I'd learned enough about living with a controlling spouse to know better than to keep evidence where he could find it. The photos of bruises were harder to explain, even to myself. The first time I took one, it felt like I was betraying my marriage somehow, like I was planning for failure instead of working toward healing. But after the 4th or 5th incident, I realized I wasn't planning for failure. I was documenting it. I got good at makeup, really good. The kind of good that comes from necessity rather than passion. I could cover a black eye so thoroughly that my own mother wouldn't notice. though to be fair, Matthew had done such a thorough job of isolating me that my mother hadn't seen me in person for months anyway. The isolation had been so gradual I barely noticed it happening. First, it was missing family dinners because we were too busy with the business. Then it was declining invitations because Matthew thought my friends were negative influences. Eventually, it was working from home so much that I rarely saw anyone except suppliers and the occasional delivery driver. But isolation works both ways, and Matthew had made one crucial error in his campaign to control me. He'd forgotten that I was actually good at my job. While he was busy playing dress-up CEO, I was maintaining relationships with everyone who actually mattered in our industry. The suppliers loved working with me because I treated them like human beings instead of inconvenient obstacles to profit. The influencers preferred my campaigns because I understood their audiences and created content that actually worked. The designers wanted to partner with us because I appreciated their artistry instead of just seeing them as sources of cheap product. Matthew thought he was the face of Rivera Boutique Collections, but I was its beating heart. And hearts, as it turns out, are much harder to replace than faces. The beginning of the end came when Matthew announced he was filing for divorce. Not because he'd fallen out of love with me, mind you, but because our business had finally hit the milestone he'd been waiting for, our first $1 million revenue year. "Lisa," he said over breakfast one Tuesday morning, as casually as if he were commenting on the weather, "I think we need to talk about the future of our relationship." I looked up from my coffee, the good stuff I'd bought with money from our successful business, the business I'd built with my own expertise and connections, and saw a stranger sitting across from me. This wasn't the charming entrepreneur who'd swept me off my feet. This wasn't even the abusive husband who'd been systematically destroying my self-worth for 2 years. This was something else entirely, a predator who'd decided it was time to consume his prey. "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me already knew. I think we want different things," Matthew said, his voice taking on that practiced tone that told me this speech had been rehearsed. "You're focused on the day-to-day operations, but I'm thinking bigger picture. I need a partner who shares my vision for where this company can go." The audacity was breathtaking. The company that existed entirely because of my vision, my work, my money, and my connections. And he was telling me I lacked vision. "And what vision is that?" I asked. Matthew leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who thought he held all the cards. National expansion, department store partnerships, maybe even international licensing deals, big picture stuff that requires someone who understands corporate strategy. "I see," I said. "And I don't understand corporate strategy?" "Lisa, you're great at what you do," he said in that patronizing voice that had become his default setting. "The social media stuff, the day-to-day management. But scaling a business requires different skills, more executive-level thinking." Executive-level thinking. From the man whose idea of strategic planning was buying lottery tickets and hoping for the best. "So what are you saying exactly?" I asked. Matthew pulled out a folder that had clearly been prepared by a lawyer. "I'm saying I think we should dissolve our marriage so we can focus on what we're both good at. You can continue in a consulting role with the company, and I can focus on taking Rivera Boutique Collections to the next level." He slid the papers across the table like he was offering me a business proposal instead of the complete destruction of my life. "I've tried to be fair about the division of assets. You'll get the condo, obviously, and a reasonable settlement. The business will remain with me, since it's registered in my name and represents my family's legacy." His family's legacy. The business that had been hemorrhaging money until I salvaged it was suddenly a precious family heirloom. I looked at the divorce papers without touching them. "And what makes you think I'll agree to this?" Matthew's smile had all the warmth of a reptile basking on a rock. "Because you're smart enough to know when you're beaten, Lisa. This is my world. These are my connections, my suppliers, my customers. You think you can just walk away and start over? Good luck with that." He was so confident, so absolutely certain that he'd won. And why wouldn't he be? Every legal document had his name on it. Every business relationship had been cultivated under his company's banner. Every success had been publicly attributed to his leadership. But Matthew had made the same mistake that mediocre men have been making since the beginning of time. He'd confused taking credit for work with actually doing work, and he was about to learn the difference. "I need some time to think about this," I said. Matthew's expression softened into what he probably thought was magnanimity. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But Lisa..." His voice took on that dangerous edge I'd learned to recognize. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, for both our sakes." The threat was subtle, but clear. Agree to his terms or face the consequences. The same consequences I'd been facing for 2 years, except now he was making them official. That night, while Matthew was out celebrating his impending freedom with friends who probably had no idea he was a wife-beating thief, I sat in our condo and made a list. Not a grocery list or a to-do list, but a war plan. I had $60,000 left in my personal account, money I'd been slowly moving out of our joint accounts over the past few months. Call it intuition, call it survival instinct, but something had told me to start building a financial escape route long before Matthew had made his divorce announcement official. I had copies of every important business document, every supplier contract, every influencer agreement, every piece of correspondence that proved my role in building Rivera boutique collections. Matthew thought he'd been clever keeping me off the official paperwork, but he'd forgotten that business relationships aren't built on paperwork. They're built on trust, reliability, and actually knowing what you're doing. Most importantly, I had something Matthew didn't even know existed: detailed documentation of every illegal thing he'd done over the past 2 years. The business funds used for personal expenses, the forged signatures on supplier agreements, the tax irregularities that would make an IRS auditor's eyes light up like Christmas morning. And then there were the photos. The evidence of what happened when Matthew's passion for the business translated into violence against the woman who'd made that business possible. I called my sister Janet that night for the first time in months. "Lisa," she said, and I could hear the concern in her voice. "Oh my God, I was starting to think you'd fallen off the face of the earth." "I need to ask you something," I said, "and I need you to promise you won't judge me." "Honey, what's wrong? You sound..." "Janet, if someone hit you repeatedly and stole money from you and was trying to steal a business you'd built with your own hands, what would you do?" The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. "Lisa," Janet finally said, her voice very quiet and very serious, "are you telling me that Matthew has been hitting you?" "Among other things." "Pack a bag," she said immediately. "Right now. Come stay with me. We'll figure out the rest later." "I can't just leave," I said. "If I leave now, he wins. He gets the business. He gets to tell his story about the crazy wife who abandoned him, and I get nothing." "Lisa, forget the business. Forget the money. If he's hurting you..." "The business is my life's work, Janet. It's everything I've built, everything I've sacrificed for. I'm not walking away from it. I'm taking it back." Another long silence. "Okay," Janet said finally. "What do you need me to do?" The thing about being systematically underestimated for 2 years is that it gives you a tremendous advantage when you finally decide to fight back. Matthew had spent so much time convincing himself and everyone else that I was just the wife who helped with marketing, that he'd forgotten I was actually a competent business professional with a functioning brain and a very legitimate grudge. While Matthew was busy celebrating his brilliant plan to steal my life's work, I was building what I like to think of as the business equivalent of a nuclear weapon. I called it Chen Fashion House, and it was designed to do one thing very, very well: destroy Rivera boutique collections. The first step was reconnaissance. I needed to understand exactly how vulnerable Matthew's business really was without me. Turns out, extremely vulnerable, but in ways even I hadn't fully grasped. You see, Matthew had made another crucial error in his campaign to erase me from our company's success story. He'd never actually learned how to do any of the work I'd been doing. He couldn't manage supplier relationships because he didn't understand the fashion industry well enough to speak the language. He couldn't maintain influencer partnerships because he had the social media instincts of a particularly awkward penguin. He couldn't even handle basic customer service because his solution to every problem was to blame someone else and hope it went away. What Matthew could do was look good in expensive suits and speak confidently about synergy and market penetration and other business buzzwords that sound impressive in boardrooms but don't actually mean anything when you're trying to figure out why your spring collection is 3 months late and your biggest influencer just posted about working with your competitor. My second step was recruitment, not employees. I couldn't afford employees yet, but I could afford something much more valuable: loyalty. The suppliers who'd grown tired of Matthew's condescending attitude and erratic payments, the designers who resented being treated like disposable vendors instead of creative partners, the influencers who'd been looking for an excuse to work with someone who actually understood their brand and their audience. "Lisa," said Maria Santos, one of our best suppliers, when I called her with a proposition, "I was wondering when you were going to start your own thing. Working with Matthew without you has been challenging." Challenging was diplomatic. According to Maria, Matthew had missed 3 payment deadlines, tried to negotiate a bulk discount for an order half the size of what we'd originally discussed, and somehow managed to insult her entire design team by suggesting they add more sparkles to a minimalist collection. "I'm not officially launching until next month," I told Maria, "but I wanted to give you first option on an exclusive partnership, better terms than what you're getting now, creative control over your designs, and guaranteed payment within 30 days. "You mean I wouldn't have to deal with Matthew anymore?" "You would never have to deal with Matthew again." "Where do I sign?" The influencer conversations were even easier. It turns out that when you spend 2 years building genuine relationships with people, they remember which half of a business partnership actually treated them like human beings. "Oh, thank God," said Jessica Kim, a fashion blogger with 500,000 followers, when I explained my new venture. "Matthew tried to get me to promote this hideous neon tracksuit last month. I told him my audience would never buy it, and he said maybe I needed to elevate my brand to match his vision. I've been looking for a reason to stop working with Rivera." One by one, I secured commitments from every important relationship that had made Rivera Boutique Collections successful, not through sabotage or corporate espionage, but through the simple revolutionary concept of treating people with respect and offering them better terms than they were getting from my soon-to-be ex-husband. The third step was legal protection. I'd learned my lesson about going into business without proper documentation. Every supplier agreement, every influencer contract, every partnership deal was properly structured and legally binding. I wasn't going to make the mistake of trusting anyone ever again, even people I liked. But the most important step was psychological preparation. I had to become someone new, not the naive woman who'd handed over her life savings to a charming stranger, not the abuse victim who'd apologized for her own mistreatment, but a business owner who understood exactly how ruthless this industry could be and was prepared to be just as ruthless in return. The transformation wasn't easy. It meant unlearning 2 years of conditioning that had taught me to minimize my own contributions and defer to Matthew's expertise. It meant rebuilding confidence that had been systematically destroyed by someone who needed me to feel small in order for him to feel big. But it also meant remembering who I'd been before Matthew, a successful marketing professional who'd built a career on understanding what people wanted and figuring out how to give it to them. That person was still there, buried under layers of fear and self-doubt, but still there. The divorce proceedings, meanwhile, were going exactly as Matthew had planned. His lawyer presented me as an unemployed spouse with no legitimate claim to business assets, while carefully avoiding any mention of where the capital to build those assets had actually come from. "Mrs. Rivera," Matthew's lawyer said during our first mediation session. My client is prepared to be generous in the settlement, but we need to be realistic about your contributions to the business. Supporting a spouse's entrepreneurial ventures is admirable, but it doesn't constitute ownership. I sat there quietly, letting Matthew's legal team paint their picture of me as a gold-digging housewife who'd never had an original business idea in her life. Let them think I was defeated. Let them think I was going to accept their insulting settlement offer and disappear quietly into the night. My client is prepared to offer $50,000 and full ownership of the condominium, the lawyer continued. Given Mrs. Rivera's limited professional prospects, we believe this represents more than fair compensation. Limited professional prospects. I almost laughed out loud. We'll need some time to consider the offer, my lawyer said, which was code for, my client is about to unleash legal and business hell on your client, but we're going to let you think you're winning for a little while longer. That night, I finalized the last details of Chen Fashion House's launch strategy. The website would go live on Monday. The first collection would be available for pre-order on Wednesday. The influencer campaign would launch on Friday. By the following Monday, Rivera Boutique Collections would discover what it felt like to compete against someone who actually knew what they were doing. Matthew, meanwhile, was already starting to realize that running a fashion business without someone who understood fashion was somewhat more challenging than he'd anticipated. He'd called me twice that week asking for consulting help with supplier issues, apparently unable to grasp that the woman he was divorcing and publicly humiliating might not be enthusiastic about helping him maintain the business he'd stolen from her. Lisa, I know this is awkward, he said during his second call, but Maria Santos is being completely unreasonable about this spring delivery schedule. She's saying things that don't make sense about lead times and minimum orders. Could you maybe give her a call and sort it out? The audacity was stunning. He wanted me to fix his problems while he was actively trying to steal my life's work. I'm sorry, Matthew, I said sweetly, but as your lawyer explained, I have limited professional prospects. I wouldn't want to give Maria advice I'm not qualified to provide. Lisa, don't be like this. You know I didn't mean what? That I have limited professional prospects? That my contributions to Rivera Boutique Collections were minimal? That I'm basically an unemployed housewife looking for a handout? Silence. Good luck with Maria, I said, and hung up. Chen Fashion House launched on a Monday morning with the kind of coordinated precision that would have made a military strategist proud. By 9 a.m., our website was live with a collection that had been months in the planning. By noon, 3 major fashion bloggers had posted about our launch. By 5 p.m., we'd sold out of our limited edition debut pieces. Matthew found out about my new business the way most people find out about things these days, through social media, specifically through an Instagram post from Jessica Kim featuring herself in one of our signature dresses with the caption, "So excited to partner with Chen Fashion House, finally working with a brand that gets it. There's ethical fashion, Satsina, women empowering women." He called me within minutes, and I have to admit, hearing the panic in his voice was almost as satisfying as seeing our first day sales numbers. Lisa, what the hell is this? You can't start a competing business while we're in the middle of divorce proceedings. That's corporate espionage or something. Actually, Matthew, it's called capitalism, I said, examining my manicure with the kind of casual indifference that I knew would drive him crazy. You know, that thing where people with good ideas and business skills create companies that serve customers better than their competitors. You signed a non-compete agreement. No, Matthew, I didn't. You might want to check your files more carefully. Though given your track record with paperwork, I understand why you might be confused. The truth was, Matthew had never asked me to sign a non-compete because he'd never seen me as a threat. In his mind, I was just the helpful wife who did social media and talked to suppliers. It had never occurred to him that I might be capable of building something on my own. Lisa, be reasonable. You can't just steal my business model. Your business model? I laughed, and it felt good to laugh at him instead of with him for once. Matthew, you don't have a business model. You have a barely functional company that exists entirely because I built it for you. There's a difference. I'm calling my lawyer. You should probably call your suppliers instead. I hear Maria Santos has some concerns about your spring delivery. The line went dead, and I smiled. Round 1 to Chen Fashion House. The next few weeks were like watching a very expensive car crash in slow motion. Every day brought new evidence that Matthew had no idea how to run the business without me, and every day brought new victories for my own company. The suppliers were the first to jump ship, and honestly, I couldn't blame them. Matthew had somehow managed to alienate every manufacturer we'd worked with by treating them like disposable vendors instead of business partners. When they started getting calls from Chen Fashion House offering better terms, faster payments, and actual respect for their work, the choice was obvious. Lisa, Maria Santos told me during one of our planning calls, I tried to work with Matthew after you left. I really did. But he wanted me to copy designs from Zara and sell them at premium prices. When I explained that wasn't how fashion worked, he told me I was being unnecessarily complicated, and maybe he needed to find suppliers who were more business-focused. Business-focused, I repeated, meaning willing to help him commit intellectual property theft? Apparently, though he didn't put it quite so elegantly. The influencers were next. It turns out that when you've built genuine relationships with people, they remember who treated them well and who treated them like walking advertisements. Matthew's attempts to maintain our influencer partnerships without understanding how influencer marketing actually worked were, let's call them educational. Jessica Kim sent me screenshots of their email exchange, and honestly, I felt embarrassed on Matthew's behalf. He tried to negotiate a lower rate for a campaign by explaining that Rivera Boutique Collections was more established than Chen Fashion House and therefore deserved preferential pricing. When Jessica pointed out that she'd be promoting our competitor, Matthew suggested she could just not mention that part in her posts. He wanted me to secretly promote his brand while pretending to work with you, Jessica told me over coffee. I explained that was called fraud, and he said I was being overly technical about business arrangements. Overly technical about fraud. The customers were the final nail in Rivera Boutique Collections' coffin. It turns out that when you build a brand around quality, creativity, and authentic relationships, people notice when those things disappear. Matthew's attempts to maintain our product quality without understanding our supply chain resulted in what can only be described as a masterclass in how to destroy brand reputation. Our former customers started posting comparison photos on social media, Rivera's declining quality next to Chen Fashion House's superior products. The comments were brutal, but fair. What happened to Rivera? This doesn't look anything like what I ordered. So glad I found Chen Fashion House. This is what Rivera used to be. Matthew tried to stem the bleeding by cutting prices, which only made things worse. Nothing says my business is failing quite like desperately slashing prices on products that are already inferior to your competitors' offerings. By month 3, Rivera Boutique Collections had lost approximately 70% of its revenue. By month 6, Matthew was calling me again. But this time, the panic in his voice had been replaced by something that sounded suspiciously like desperation. Lisa, we need to talk. Not about the divorce, about business. I think we can work something out. What kind of something? I'm prepared to offer you a consulting contract. Good money, equity in the company, recognition for your contributions. We can rebuild this thing together. The irony was delicious. 6 months earlier, Matthew had been explaining to divorce mediators that I had limited professional prospects. Now he was begging me to save the business I'd built and he'd destroyed. That's an interesting offer, Matthew, but I'm a little busy with my own company. You know, the one that's actually successful. Lisa, please, I know I made mistakes. Mistakes? I interrupted. Matthew, you stole my business, tried to erase me from its history, and physically abused me when I questioned your decisions. Those aren't mistakes. Those are crimes. Silence. But here's what I will do. I continued. I'll make you an offer for Rivera Boutique Collections. Cash purchase, quick closing. You can walk away with something instead of watching it die slowly. You want to buy my company? I want to buy my company back. The offer I made was insultingly low, but it was also more than Matthew was likely to get from anyone else. Rivera Boutique Collections was hemorrhaging money, had virtually no remaining customer base, and carried enough debt to sink a small country. The only assets of any value were the brand name and the customer email list. And honestly, the brand name was becoming more of a liability than an asset given its declining reputation. Matthew's lawyer called mine the next day. My client rejects your offer. It's far below the company's actual value. What actual value? My lawyer replied. Your client's company has negative cash flow, no remaining supplier relationships, and is facing potential bankruptcy within the next 6 months. My client's offer represents a generous premium over the company's liquidation value. It was true. I'd done my homework. Rivera Boutique Collections was worth exactly what I'd offered for it, possibly less. But Matthew's ego wouldn't let him accept that the business he'd stolen from me was now worthless without me. My client is prepared to consider other options for the business, his lawyer said, including potential partnerships with other fashion companies. Good luck with that, my lawyer said. I'm sure there are lots of companies interested in acquiring a failing business with a damaged reputation and no remaining competitive advantages. There weren't, of course. Matthew spent the next 3 months trying to find a buyer, a partner, an investor, or anyone willing to throw money at his sinking ship. But Rivera Boutique Collections had become a cautionary tale in the fashion industry, a successful brand that had self-destructed through incompetent management and questionable business practices. The bankruptcy filing came on a Tuesday morning, almost exactly 1 year after Matthew had announced our divorce. I was in my office at Chen Fashion House, reviewing designs for our fall collection, when my lawyer called with the news. Rivera Boutique Collections filed for Chapter 11 this morning, she said. The assets will be auctioned off to pay creditors. When's the auction? Next Friday. Are you interested? Very. The bankruptcy auction was held in a sterile conference room that smelled like disappointment and cheap coffee. Matthew sat at a table with his lawyer, looking like a man who'd aged about 10 years in the past 12 months. His expensive suits had been replaced by off-the-rack clothing, and his confident swagger had been replaced by the defeated posture of someone who'd finally run out of people to blame for his failures. I arrived 15 minutes late, partly because I'd been stuck in traffic and partly because I wanted to make an entrance. I was wearing one of Chen Fashion House's signature pieces, a tailored blazer that had been featured in 3 fashion magazines and cost more than Matthew was probably making in a month these days. The auctioneer was a tired-looking man who clearly wanted to get through the proceedings as quickly as possible. The assets of Rivera Boutique Collections weren't exactly generating fierce bidding competition. Most of the inventory was outdated or poor quality. The equipment was leased rather than owned, and the intellectual property had about as much value as a chocolate teapot. Lot 17, the auctioneer announced, business name, trademark, customer database, and remaining goodwill associated with Rivera Boutique Collections. This was what I'd come for. Not because the Rivera brand had any real value. Chen Fashion House was already more successful than Rivera had ever been, but because I wanted to own the name that Matthew had used to steal credit for my work. Opening bid is $10,000, the auctioneer said. I raised my hand. Matthew's head snapped up, and for the first time in the proceedings, he looked directly at me. The expression on his face was priceless, a mixture of shock, recognition, and dawning horror as he realized who was about to become the owner of his former empire. Do I hear 15,000? Silence. Apparently, nobody else was interested in buying a defunct fashion brand with a reputation for poor quality and worse management. Going once, going twice, sold to bidder number 7 for $10,000. And just like that, Rivera Boutique Collections belonged to me, all of it. The name Matthew had put on business cards while taking credit for my work, the social media accounts he'd used to promote himself as a fashion visionary, the trademark he'd filed while erasing me from the company's history. I owned it all, and I'd bought it for less than Matthew used to spend on a single night out with his poker buddies. Matthew approached me as the auction was wrapping up. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of his failures and the reality of his situation. "Lisa," he said quietly, "can we talk?" I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in months. This was the man who'd promised to love and protect me, then spent 2 years systematically destroying my confidence and stealing my work. This was the man who'd hit me for questioning his business decisions, then tried to erase me from the business entirely. This was the man who'd been so convinced of his own superiority that he'd never even considered the possibility that I might fight back. What is there to talk about, Matthew? I know I made mistakes. You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means. Matthew's jaw tightened, and for a moment I saw a flash of the old anger, the old entitlement, but it died quickly, replaced by the desperate pleading of a man who'd finally run out of options. "Lisa, please. I know things got complicated between us, but we built something good together. Rivera Boutique Collections was our dream, our vision. You can't just destroy that." "I'm not destroying anything," I said calmly. "I'm simply reclaiming what was always mine." I pulled out my phone and showed him a press release that Chen Fashion House would be issuing the next morning. Rivera Boutique Collections will officially cease operations as of today. The brand name and all associated trademarks will be retired permanently. All customer inquiries will be redirected to Chen Fashion House, where they'll receive the quality and service they deserve. Matthew's face went white. "You're erasing me completely." "No, Matthew, you erased yourself. I'm just making it official. This is revenge, pure and simple revenge." "You're right," I said, and for the first time in the conversation, I smiled. It is revenge, but it's also justice, and it's also just good business. Matthew stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time, which in a way he was. The woman standing in front of him bore very little resemblance to the naive, trusting person he'd married and abused. That woman had been broken down and rebuilt into someone stronger, smarter, and infinitely less forgiving. "You've changed," he said. "Yes, I have. Thank you for teaching me that I needed to." I turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at him one more time. "Oh, and Matthew? If you're looking for work, Chen Fashion House is always hiring. We have an opening in our warehouse. Entry level, minimum wage, no benefits. You'd report to our floor supervisor, who happens to be a woman. Interested?" The look on his face was worth every penny I'd paid for the satisfaction of that moment. Chen Fashion House now occupies 3 floors of a converted warehouse in Chicago's Fashion District. We employ 78 people, including several women who've overcome their own experiences with domestic abuse. Our annual revenue is approaching $8 million, and we've been featured in Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, and every major fashion blog that matters. I'm writing this from my corner office, where I can see Lake Michigan through floor-to-ceiling windows that I chose myself. On my desk is a photo from our latest fashion show, where our new sustainable collection received a standing ovation. Next to it is a smaller frame containing the first dollar Chen Fashion House ever earned, along with a note that reads, "For every woman who's ever been told she's nothing without a man, prove them wrong." Matthew, as far as I know, is working at a sporting goods store in the suburbs. He tried to start another fashion business about a year ago, but apparently word gets around in the industry about people who steal credit and abuse their partners. His new venture lasted approximately 3 months before folding due to lack of supplier and investor interest. He sent me a Facebook message on the anniversary of our divorce, asking if we could talk about old times. I screenshotted it and shared it with my therapist, who said it was a perfect example of how abusers try to maintain control even after their victims have moved on. Then I blocked his account and deleted the message without responding. I'm dating someone new now, James, a photographer who documents stories of women overcoming adversity. He's nothing like Matthew. He listens when I talk about business. He celebrates my successes without trying to take credit for them. He's never once raised his voice at me, let alone his hand. When I told him about my marriage to Matthew, his response was to ask what he could do to help me heal, not to minimize what I'd been through or suggest I should move on. "You know what I admire most about you?" James said recently as we were looking at photos from Chen Fashion House's latest campaign. "What's that?" "You didn't just survive what happened to you, you turned it into power." He's right. The woman who married Matthew Rivera was looking for someone to complete her, to validate her worth, to make her dreams come true. The woman writing this story knows that her worth comes from within, that her dreams are her own responsibility, and that the only person who can complete her is herself. Matthew thought he was destroying me when he hit me, when he stole from me, when he tried to erase me from the business I'd built. What he actually did was teach me exactly how strong I could be when I stopped asking for permission to defend myself. Every time a woman emails me asking for advice about leaving an abusive partner, every time someone shares their story of rebuilding after betrayal, every time I see another woman refusing to accept less than she deserves, I think about that night when Matthew told me I was nothing without him. He was wrong about a lot of things, but he was especially wrong about that. I am everything with or without anyone else, and now I have a business empire, a bank account, and a life that proves it. The best revenge, as it turns out, isn't getting even. It's getting everything you deserve and then using your success to help other people get everything they deserve too. Matthew taught me that I was capable of surviving anything. I taught myself that I was capable of thriving despite everything. And that, I've discovered, is a much more valuable lesson. So there you have it, how to turn your worst marriage into your best business decision. What amazed me in my analytics was seeing viewers from all around the world, Tokyo, London, Mexico City, places I definitely couldn't find on a map. Apparently, stories about terrible husbands are universal. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and if this made you feel better about your own life choices, subscribe for more revenge stories. Because watching other people's disasters is cheaper than therapy.